First bootcamp of the 2023 Zeroing Methane Emissions Datathon. My name's David Shackleton, and we're here at the SLB Calgary headquarters downtown. We're also on Treaty 7 territory. I'd like to acknowledge that these lands are home to the Stoney Nakoda nations of the Wesley, Chiniki, and Bearspaw, three nations of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Piikani, Kainai, and Siksika, and the Tsuut'ina of the Dene people. Treaty 7 territory is also shared with the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. We acknowledge the past, present, and future generations of these nations who help steward this land, as well as honor and celebrate this place. So this Datathon event is a joint effort between these three organizations. You see their logos on the screen. So SB International Calgary section, we are about 2,500 members here in the Calgary area and around Canada. Globally, about 100,000 people, mostly engineers. Untapped Energy, an organization that came out of a Datathon that was organized in 2018, and we've been organizing Datathons since and monthly meetups. So please get involved with those if you're into data science, particularly for energy. And the Canadian Heavy Oil Association, CHOA, is represented here. They've been helping organize the event, and we really appreciate that, and that their members are joining too. We kicked off the event last week in Subja headquarters again. We're here on the second event, the first bootcamp introducing methane emissions. The competition itself kicks off next week, where we have the GM of Enterprise Analytics from Suncor joining us, Sam Hayes, to give us the keynote there. Please register for that. The QR code was on the front screen. I'll pop back to that in a minute. Then about a week later, we'll close entry to the competition. So you do have time, even after the competition starts, to find more team members and get more people involved. We'll have another boot camp as the competition starts, February 15th, where you'll learn about processing the images that you have access to. And then the competition closes towards the end of Feb. Then the judges have about a month to look through your entries and decide on the winners, which will be announced at the closing ceremony March 7th at the Calgary Petroleum Club, where we'll have a keynote speaker representing our key sponsors, Northwest Capital Partners and Cube, Ian McGregor, founder of Northwest Refining, amongst other organizations. It'll be great to see him, so come along to that. And again, please do register. I'll just flip back, use that QR code there if you like, or go to the sbeuntapped.com to register, or the SB Calgary website, and find it under the events.
Thank you, David. And I'll try and keep myself on time with regards to the discussions later on so we can have some open Q&A. But what I was tasked with doing today is to kind of give a brief introduction to methane emissions. What drives it? What are the solutions for it? Why are we interested in this? And before I get started, any good presentation that's being done probably needs some reference to thanks. Some of my colleagues mentioned here, Drew, Gary, Sheldon, part of the SEAS team in SLB and also part of the MPS team. They did have a huge hand in a lot of the material I'll be showing today. And getting further into the mindset of why do we care about methane, there's a lot of talk about greenhouse gas emissions. When we look at greenhouse gas emissions, a lot of the conversations start with CO2, and then they very quickly go to CO2 equivalent. When we think about methane, there's a lot of numbers and multipliers running around, but either way, the bottom line is that methane contains and traps more heat than CO2. And therefore, it is something that if you can get rid of 1 kilogram of methane in the atmosphere versus 1 kilogram of CO2, you're going to get better payback. When we think about how much heat methane traps versus the rest of the emissions, a study was done where the responsibility of 0.5 degree of the heating of the total 1.1 since the Industrial Revolution was blamed on methane itself. And going a little bit further, we're showing the projection of methane in the next 20, 40, 60, 80 years. And what we can see is that methane itself will degrade in the atmosphere and it'll become less potent as a greenhouse gas emission. But at the same time, in the next 20 years, while it's degrading in the atmosphere, it still has as much potential as the CO2 emissions themselves. So this is partly why we start looking into the effects that methane has on overall greenhouse warming. And then we start looking at images such as this. Where is the CO2 equivalent emissions coming from? On the left-hand side, we can see out of 40 billion tons of CO2 being emitted per year, a good chunk of that, just over 5, is directly related to Scope 1 emissions with the oil and gas methane sector. On the right-hand side, we're starting to look at the different images of the flaring and venting, the heating power, and then we're also looking at the transportation and other things like hydrogen generation that cause or are causes of the methane. When it comes to looking at where is this methane coming from and breaking it down a little bit further, we can see the pie chart that just appeared in the bottom right, showing the pipelines, the piping stations, gas plants, the gathering and the boosting stations, as well as the well pads, and even inside the city, which gives an idea of the different contributors with the onshore methane emissions. Now, when we start tasking ourselves with looking at what to do to abate the emissions, there are a couple of different contributors, and each of these contributors you see in the different parts of the world when you're talking about abatement of methane. The first one is the corporate commitments. So even if an operator or an asset is not interested in reducing their methane emissions from the capital or the revenue or the return, it might be that a couple of levels above have told them that this is part of their KPOs. With that, there's also the government regulations. Some countries are doing this much better than others, but in general, the governments are now stepping in and they're doing two things. They're either penalizing or they're incentivizing. Both of those do have an impact on what industry is doing with their methane. And we also have the investor pressure. So a lot of the investment groups are now coming in and saying, we want to invest in companies that are interested about the environment. They're going to do something to make sure that we don't have a negative impact. And therefore, the money now comes with a price of being the stewardship of the environmental side. Of course, thinking of methane is a good way to do so. Going on to the bottom level, we have loss prevention. One of the things that I'm going to be going through in the next couple of slides is that when you're actually abating the loss of methane, you're putting that back into your pipelines, back into your process, back into your revenue generation. So some companies are just saying, we want to make more money. And that is at least killing two birds with one stone, so to speak. We also have certified gas. There's a lot of companies these days that are buying what we would call certified or more friendly gas or more green gas. So in those situations, if you can sell your gas for higher prices because of efforts of methane abatement, that is another driving force. And then the last one that comes up in some regions more now than ever before with the satellites and other sensors that are coming online is the non-government organizations that are doing the name and shame game. So they're coming up to the fence lines, they're taking emissions, looking at what the satellite information is providing, and they're saying, oh my goodness, this company, this entity, they've done all of this venting, they've done all of this, blowdown or something, and now we want to make the public aware of it. And again, it comes back to the overall interests that are driving the methane. When we go to government regulations, just talking a little bit about our backyard, there are things such as a Directive 60, which talks about, in the bottom there, that you want to make sure that you look at, can the flaring, incineration, venting, can it be eliminated? Can it be reduced, if not eliminated? And then will the flaring, incineration, venting meet performance standards? So even if you're doing it, are you doing it to the standards that they expect it to be done? Also, later on, I'll show a slide on why you need to be worried about things being done properly, even when it comes to the combustion side. There also is the Directive 17 that talks about measurement, volume tracking, etc. And if I'm going to shift to the other side, the Alt-FEMP is something that's also come through. And what the government's also doing is recognizing that even though you can monitor methane fugitive emissions and such with the handheld OGI cameras, there are now new innovations and technologies coming online that in the right circumstances bring a lot more benefit. And in those situations, Alt-FEMP is looking at regulating those alternative technologies to look at methane and gather data. And considering that this is a datathon, this of course goes well with the topic today. When we're looking at those multipliers, I've been asked a lot of times, what number do you use? Is it 24? Is it 84? Is it 25? You see all these numbers going around all the time. And staying in the right mindset, unfortunately, what complicates the efforts is that it depends where you are in the world and who you're talking to in that area of the world. So the table up on the top right-hand side shows some of the multipliers, not only when it comes to the 100-year or the 20-year, but also when it comes to the different years that different reports were being published. There are also new publications that have come out, some through Seas and SLB, that suggest that it could be calculated from looking at how the degradation occurs in the atmosphere. So it wouldn't be a 25 multiplier or an 84, it would be somewhere in the middle that properly represents how long methane is staying in the atmosphere. Then you start seeing different types of emissions like hydrogen emissions coming into play because of their relationship or activities with these other greenhouse emissions. So when we're looking at the flaring or combustion, one of the things that I mentioned is it's the standards of how you do it. This picture right here is showing an open flare that has about 96.5% combustion efficiency. There were some details looking into overall combustion efficiencies. What do you typically see in the field? What should you expect? And some of the numbers were closer to the 90 range, 91s, 92s. So 96.5, you might even see as quite a good efficiency of combustion. But when we start comparing that to an incinerator that might be doing 99.9 plus combustion efficiency, and we look at 100 units of CO2 equivalent being created from the open flare, that extra addition of combustion efficiency halves the equivalent CO2 emissions if you're using the 84 multiplier. So sometimes what we come in and we look at is not even if you're going to convert it to something, if you're going to turn it to power, if you're going to make synthetic fuels, it's just how well can you burn it? If you're venting something, obviously the impact is going to be much greater because the combustion efficiency is really zero. The other thing with incinerators is from a PR point of view, instead of seeing a large flare across the fence from the public's perspective, we're now just seeing a gentle glow in the sky. Noise, heat, radiation, those are also significantly reduced with incinerators, and that's why we start seeing some of this technology starting to take off. But again, one of the underlying things when thinking of the methane emission impact is how well that combustion is taking place. Going one slide beyond methane, we start looking at the other major greenhouse gas emitters. So when we look at the CO2, that's a one-to-one. We can see methane taking its place there. But for the N2O and all of the fluoride, fluoro or fluoride type components, we can see the multipliers become much more significant. But the one reason why we're still pulling back and focusing on methane is it's the amount of each. So when we look at this from a kilogram to kilogram perspective, there's just not enough content of some of these more trace greenhouse gases that can be collected or reduced to make the same impact in the short term as methane. Their time will come, but for now we can focus on what we can consider a lower hanging fruit. So what is the oil and gas industry's role to play in all of this? when it comes to looking at a more global side of things, the EPA looked at an inventory of GHG emissions. They claimed that around 31% in 2019 was due to the oil and gas industry. So that's why we have a role to play in this. There's also the agriculture, there's the wastewater, there's the landfills, there's other stuff that creates these emissions. But when we even think about the Alberta's perspective, it's much higher than the 31% shown here. And it's estimated that almost 3/4 of the methane emissions in Alberta comes from the oil and gas sector. That, I'm glad to say, has dropped significantly since the efforts were starting to put into play. But when we start looking at the reductions, we can look at controlled emissions. And in that case, we're avoiding or eliminating the emissions by getting rid of the flaring, getting rid of the venting, detecting where the fugitive leaks are happening and doing the LDAR, so the repair after detection. And we're also looking at the optimizing emissions intensity. So one of the things that's really difficult is when you say how much emissions is this facility creating, how much is this emissions from this pumping station? That is a number that's very hard to represent depending on how much production is going through. So a lot of times what you want to do is look at it from an intensity point of view. And even though there might be huge emission producers, the fact that their emissions intensity is very low shows that they're doing, or at least on the right track for what we're looking at when it comes to methane abatement or emissions abatement overall. The offset in emissions through CO2 capture and either utilization, storage, something along those lines, and also the recycling and reuse are other things for overall reduction in emissions. But I think for the Datathon related to methane, we're more focused on the first two. So the value of industry to methane, again, I was mentioning that there is value to be had in just the abatement of methane. And why is there such a better economic payback period? Right here, what I've done is I've broken down a pie chart that might represent the CO2 equivalent emissions of upstream, either offshore or onshore. In this case, there's a huge majority that has to do with CO2 directly with combustions, with combustion for generating power, combustion to generate heat, rotational equipment, whatever it might be. And that number can easily shift to 80%. And then there is also the venting and the pneumatics, the flaring and the fugitive. Now, when we look at the fugitive, 10% for some might seem very high. At the same time, most might be representing their fugitive emissions at 1 to 3%. A lot of this is not actually being measured. These are correlations that are being applied, and for the better or for the worse, a lot of times they're favorable. Some companies that swear to the fact that they're less than 3%, they've done the emission checks, now it's up to 9%. It's a good reality check, but it's a reality check that a lot of companies do not want to do up front before they're ready to take the next steps to reducing what they find. Well, what ends up happening is with that combustion, the CO2 equivalent, it does have some methane slip, some hydrocarbon slip, it has other types of emissions, but the majority of it is CO2, nitrogen, and water. You can find value out of it, but it's more of a challenge than the other side that has methane and hydrocarbon rich content, which is good for techno-economic opportunities. So what can you do with this? You can re-inject it through gas recovery into your sales lines. You can bring it back into the feed if it still needs some processing before it goes into those pipelines for sale. Or you can convert it into produced value, whether it's heat, power, chemicals, Bitcoin, whatever you might think of. So when we're going through a step-by-step on planning towards zero emissions, the first thing that we usually think about is methane measurement. And a lot of this is where the data starts coming in, and then you need to start dealing with that data, finding the outliers, everything else that comes with it. Now, those can be through top measured or schedule measured, more local, more overview. And then we can start looking at technologies, not for the methane directly from the fugitive side, but the methane that we're expecting from the flaring, where it might not be the full combustion efficiency, and we've already seen what impact that might have. We then go to the facility optimization. So a lot of good effort is being done to try and reduce the venting and flaring through optimization of the operational conditions. So the upsets, reducing those, different shutdowns with the blowdowns, all of those start trying to get put towards reducing the overall emissions impact. And the next step after that, once you recognize some of the reduced venting and flaring, is starting to look at what is the best way of taking what you're now flaring and venting and bringing that to value. So through all of these different steps, you kind of start creating a plan to move forward. Unfortunately, there's no silver bullet when you start looking at monitoring and measuring and getting the data that you need when it comes to where your emissions are sourced from. So here on the left-hand side, there's just a couple of mentions. I'll go through some of them in more detail. We have satellites, we have airplanes, we have drones, we have point sensors, we have LiDAR cameras. All of these different technologies are good at something, and usually they're also bad at something. And if you use them in the right combination and you respect the data that's coming through from what they're measuring, you can get an overall good, best economic picture. And some of the unique validation that goes to these are sealed chambers, wind tunnels, outdoor testing, because it's one thing to test it in the laboratory, it's the next to bring it out in the field where there's large buildings, wind going through, a lot of different distractions to getting good data. And then in a lot of times, what you might not be able to monitor or measure very well, you might be able to do it through simulation. I'll talk a little bit more on this point, but a lot of times you can get at least a baseline out of the simulation side of things, but there are some gaps that have to be filled when it comes to the actual hardware with measurement. Talking about those steps, we can also simplify it down to these three right here, where when we're looking at a solution pathway, we first want to plan, then we want to measure, and then we want to act on it. So planning starts looking at what type of measurement devices are you going to use? How are you going to collect the data? How are you going to use the data? How are you going to filter it? Whatever else you might be planning. And then you're going to go at that point in time, once you found the best pathway, to actually measuring it and putting the instrumentation out in the field. At that point in time, when you have a good baseline and you have more exacts on what challenge you're facing, then you want to act upon it. So that's when you're going to bring out the technologies that can reduce the emissions that are coming based off the planned measurement activities that you've done before. So one example right here of the plan moving towards ACT is there is an OGMP partnership, and what they're looking at is giving potentially a gold standard to some of the larger or even smaller companies. And there's over 60 right now, when I last looked, from the midstream and downstream sections that are moving towards trying to properly record and certify their emissions. There are 5 levels of detail with the OGMP, starting with the very basic 1, 2, and 3 levels of just correlations, rules of thumbs, kind of volumes of plants and throughput versus what they would typically emit. Then you get into level 4, which comes down to detailed engineering. The detailed engineering calculations is now where simulations can start to play. And then we finally have a level 5, which is a top-down. So the top-down is saying you're going to do some plane, satellite, drone, something that goes over the entire asset, and you're going to get a lump of emissions. If you've broken down all the detailed levels before this properly, you should be able to get a bottom-up representation and a top-down representation that match each other. And there are some thresholds for that matching. If it's out of that band range, you now have to go through some extra efforts. But in general, when we start thinking about this, there is some stuff that can be handled from the simulation side of the world and not so. So some of those detailed calculations include the utility emissions, the balances, sometimes what we consider the scope 2. So when it comes from the power generation, steam raising, such things. We also have the required process venting and flaring. So as mentioned before, if you have a good understanding of the process, the fluids going through, you should have a good idea of how much of that is going out of the top of some of the knockouts or separators and going to your headers to either be vented or flared. Storage tanks, when it comes to the expected leakage and venting, that's also something that can be calculated well inside simulation environments. But now we start looking at the controls and equipment, and the fugitive emissions. So the things that are unexpected, and that's where simulators don't quite have the right calculation or the resolution to play. But with those top couple that I mentioned, we do have the overall emission summaries, we have the CO2 equivalent calculations, and we can look at these through the entire simulation, but then we start looking at what's missing and what needs to be plugged in. So one of the things we can mention is flare combustion efficiency. From a simulator's point of view, we might have the heating value in the combustion zone. We might have the velocities from the volumetric flows and the diameter of the flare tip, and we can start making estimations on combustion efficiency. But what if it's a really windy day? Those types of things start making the challenges a little bit more deep, and also depending on the exacts of the flare, you can have different discrepancies in the efficiency. So in these cases, what we can do is we can use the simulators to estimate how much volume is going to the flare, and then we can start setting up hardware solutions. So this right here is a camera sitting on the top of a pole next to a flare. We're going to send 2 lasers that are reflected through the flare, and we're going to get a determination of both the CO2 concentration and the methane concentration. From that, we can start determining the flare combustion efficiency. It's not a volumetric calculation, which might come from the metering and the simulation, but at least with the ratio, you have an idea of what your efficiency is. At the same time, when I go to Japan or some other places, some of the individuals I know have been there as well. Some of those flare stacks are hundreds of meters high. What do you do then? Well, there's other solutions like drones. And in these types of situations, that's where there's no silver bullet. You really have to look at the landscape, the opportunities that you have, and then you have to pick the right equipment for the right job. When it comes to the bottom, the fugitive emissions, the other thing that you might be looking at is continuous monitoring. Having a snapshot in time and having the frequency of those snapshots is not as good as having some continuous information about your process. So in those cases, we start looking at point sensors. So point sensors absolutely have a part to play in regulations moving forward. As regulations get more strict and they start saying frequencies have to go up, so we have a better understanding if there's a blowdown or some sort of an unscheduled venting that will only be seen at a specific point in time, this is where continuous monitoring comes into play. So the next slide here is going to show some of the resolution of the detection solutions. Now, this is always changing. I'd say that if these slides are more than a month or 2 old, probably one of these numbers has been altered already. So I hope that there's no over or underestimation shown here. But a very general sense of magnitudes show the OGI handheld cameras, which are pretty standard for regulatory. We then have the drones. We have the trucks with the mounted cameras. We have active and passive planes as they go over, whether they're actually getting reflection or not. And then we have the satellites, whether they're private or the satellites that are public. Private satellites do have quite a closer resolution, but you usually pay for that as well. And one of the things might be how frequently they go over the world or how expensive they are to actually get the data from. And I'll show the frequency concept in the next slide, but for this slide, I also want to show on the right-hand side how different volumes across different facilities or different assets add up to a total story of methane emissions. Some of it might be hard to read, but really what it's showing is depending if it's well sites, if it's tanks, if it's pipelines, compressors, whatever else, processing plants, depending on what type of asset you're looking at the different detection sensitivity, you will get a better picture of the overall emissions. So what it shows right here is if you're only looking at everything that's over 1,000 standard cubic feet per hour of emissions, so something kind of like below above the passive airplanes, you might be getting almost 90% plus of the overall emissions for something like a processing plant or a compression station. If you're looking at well sites or tanks, you might only be looking at 60 to 80% of the emissions. So again, as long as you recognize what the challenge is, you know what application best fits that. When it comes to the frequency is something that I always wondered. I'm always kind of curious, how much does a process change day to day when it comes to typical activities in the field? So what we could do is we could imagine having a plane going through kind of the salesman path, which is the path where you're trying to get all the different emissions from all the different sites around an area, and you're trying to optimize how it does that path. But either way, you might get a once over pass on March 10th, just picking any arbitrary date. And when you go over that pass, you have the flares. Let's say there's a single point value that you're measuring. And then you want to take that value and you want to say, that is the value of whatever the combustion efficiency is. I'm going to back that out to operational conditions that I know generally from the plant because we measured the feed a couple of weeks ago. We'll apply that to the model. And how well will that fit into the overall story? So if you're going over that site day after day with an annual pass of a satellite, on the right-hand side shows some representative data of what I have seen at actual sites. And in these situations, you can see how variable those emissions are from day to day. So if you took one value from a one frequency pass, you might get an idea of what emissions you have in the field, but it could be greatly overpredicted or underpredicted. And if nothing else, the best thing to do is make sure that wherever that passover is happening, you get the data stamp representing that same passover. So at least you can have a validation between the top down and the bottom up for one timestamp. The other thing that I'll mention here is with certain technologies, like the satellites, there were huge gaps in some of the data when I started looking through northern hemispheres. And I was thinking about the time, the use of the technology, and it came to when the sun is up almost all the time. If the sun's up, you can't see sometimes the flares that are being burned through the evenings. And in this case, those gaps in data is something that you also want to recognize and make sure you have an alternative if you need data throughout those time ranges. From one of the publications that I saw with respect to where sensitivity is going to the satellite technology side of things, I wanted to give an idea about how big a flare can you see from space. Now, some technologies for satellites are better than others, but just showing this one here, they talked about the sensitivity is sufficient to detect 0.005 billion cubic meters per year of the flames. Putting it in maybe terms that others might understand better is that's equivalent to about 500,000 scuff per day or standard cubic feet per day of burning something like a methane, ethane, hydrocarbon rich stream. And if we look at the radiant view of that, we can see in the middle a 5 million and a 20 million, and then we can overlay that on the resolution that a satellite might be showing. Some satellites are limited to 700 meter resolution. Some go to 100, some go down to 20 meters, but now you can start getting an idea of how visible a flare would be when looking at the different resolutions. So I'm not saying that there's any good or bad here. I'm just trying to give an idea of if you look at a solution and they say we do 100 meter resolution, square meter, at least you have an idea of what that would look like compared to a flare. And one of the things that I started thinking of as I was putting this slide into my presentation is, what do flares look like? Are they all big? Are they all small? What's the distribution? And this right here is coming from the World Bank from 2020. And the Global Gas Flaring Reduction Partnership came together with this plot right here, showing along the bottom the numbers of flares, and then along the y-axis, the volumes of those flares. So I know it's a little bit hard to read the numbers, so I put a couple of reference points of the 10 million that we saw, half of that in the last slide, and then we have the 500,000. That was kind of where you start thinking that's the resolution that they can pick up with what they were mentioning in the publication. Now that has at least half the flares, and cumulative volume-wise, that probably is the majority of the accumulation of volume, but you're still missing out on a lot of the flares out there. And when we start talking about taking these flares and bringing them to some conversion value, that's when I just want to quickly mention here, just in the scope of things, usually between the 500,000 and the 10 million scuff, is when you start talking about those micro scale facilities of gas to power, gas to Bitcoin, the things that you might see coming up for the abatement side of methane. I'll talk a little bit more later on that. Going back to the type of measurements, we can start looking at drone capabilities. So again, where's the data good? Where's the data bad? One of the challenges with the offshore is that satellites and planes have problems with the reflective surface of the ocean. So one of the good solutions that you can use in these situations is drones. So you can fly the drones. Again, you want that salesman route of having the best opportunity to find all the different sources of emissions through a single pass. And here we can see on the right-hand side where there are some different sources that have been noticed within different levels of the offshore platform. When it comes to understanding the data that you're collecting, OGI cameras tend to be the one that they kind of say, these are the ones that you can go out in the field and you can use for your certification or your data sets. So one of the things that I want to look at is how good is the baseline of OGI cameras. If I had an OGI camera and I sent out a crew to a site and it had fugitive methane leaking, would they pick up 100% all the time? Would they miss 90% of it? What does that data set look like? So there was a really good publication that I wanted to focus on here talking about OGI handheld cameras. And what they did was they had upstream, I think it was an upstream pad, and they had a route for the different crews to walk through with their OGI cameras and try and find as many fugitive sources as they could that were purposely placed and released around the environment. So I'm not going to go through too much of the detail, but they started talking about the detection rate by emission locations. Some of them, like the one mentioned on the very side, I think it was an underground leak at the pad, wasn't detected really at all. And what it comes down to is there was no obvious pattern by the type of emitter, whether it was a tank or a separator or something along those lines, or a wellhead, or the size of the emitter that really led to it being detected or not detected. So then you start saying, well, where's the difference? Where can we find value in stuff? And what they concluded as part of this report is experience counts. So the experience of the people, the crews, they knew what to look for. They knew where to look. That actually started making a difference. So when you think about the data sets, you start thinking about how experienced are the groups gathering the data sets. And one thing that we hope with innovation and technology moving forward is that if we have point sensors, drones, we have something that might be a little bit more automated in the way it's used, hopefully that automation comes with the expertise of those that are putting that solution together. So then we start hoping that this piece of experience counts, comes with automation, and then we start getting better representation of overall methane fugitive leaks. When we're talking about where to find these things through experience, I thought that it would be nice to show some of the sources of emissions. So if you go through a facility and you think, where can leaks be found and everything, you can kind of start creating the list yourself. But here on the process side, pneumatic controls, reflux columns, test flash separators, casing vents, gas compressor seals. We also have the blowdowns. We have the tank vents, the thief hatches. Sometimes those are unfortunately left open. And then we have the fugitive emissions, not the process side, but now we have the safety valves, abandoned wells, we have the stuffing boxes. So all of those things all lead towards sources of emissions. And the worst thing is that usually they're there. Unfortunately, for some of the poor operators, they just don't know it. So in the bottom here, we're looking at the top of a tank. The operator is walking up the stairs into a giant plume of methane. So it's what we can't see that we want to make sure that we're getting the right data for. Another slide that I wanted to show out of a presentation was this one right here, also showing a general source of emissions. It's a little bit repetitive to the last slide, but we're just looking at the same idea of what different areas of processing and what type of emission sources are related to those. And it's again to get your mindset around where do we have to look and where do we have to track these emissions for a holistic view. Once we have all the data and we start thinking about what to do with all the data, we start thinking about methane platforms. We have the decarbonization platforms, but one level below that is a methane platform. And we want to make sure that regardless of where the data is coming from, whether it's a crew that went out with the handheld cameras or it's a plane that flew over, we want to make sure that we can collect all this data in the right architecture to use it as well as possible. So in some of those things that we're looking at, we want to make sure that not only are we having transparent tracking of the emissions, we know where the sources are coming from, we're tracking the progress versus the planning. So if we say this technology is coming in and it should abate this much methane, we're validating these things. We also want to make sure that we have continuous improvement plans. So we're going to use the data moving forward. And we also have to make sure that we're coordinating the efforts, and we're also giving the right detection and alerting to get those crews out into the field. When we're talking about data, the other thing that we should always be very aware of is false positives. If you have devices that you bring in to some sort of gathering network or some sort of data platform, and they keep on alerting them, they send the crews out to the field in the middle of the night to find out that there's nothing actually wrong, bad data can be an enemy against anyone who's trying to do this type of effort. So we also want to make sure that the data is vetted enough that we don't have a lot of false positives that starts making people not trust the technology and not adapt to the technology. And then we start talking about the bits and pieces of the architecture, and of course the visualization. Satellite imagery is always nice to overlay, so you have a visual representation for those who are going to go out into the field of where the leaks are being found and where they should start looking for them. So the abatement of GHG emissions, when we start looking again back at that plan, measure, and act, we start thinking about that piece of the puzzle that some of it is methane related and some of it is CO2 related. Now, from the methane point of view, we have injection that we could use, we have gas recovery, gas conversion, air pneumatics. We have a lot of different pieces of the puzzle when it comes to the solutions and the abatement. And just mentioning that the CO2 side is the same. Sometimes these can work together really well. Sometimes you can see them as different challenges. But either way, when we're talking about the methane side of things, I wanted to mention one that comes up very often, and I would actually say that this is almost looking towards older technology. It still has an application in a lot of areas of the world, but what I'm talking about here is the pneumatic devices. High bleed pneumatic devices for the control systems and stuff, they take the methane, high pressure methane, they use it to move the diaphragms, to move the control valves. After that's been used, it just gets vented out. There are technologies that are low or no bleed pneumatic controllers. Unfortunately, a lot of the brownfields in industry still have the high bleed valves. Usually the green fields are coming out with what we're looking at here for low or no bleed. But at the same time, it's how much of those do you change out and the cost associated with it. Again, the nice thing is that if there's enough methane that's being vented and you can start reducing that emission, you can bring that back into the pipeline and you have a sales back or a payback period. So one of the other things that I've seen coming out is where you have a power generation. So instead of just venting out the methane, you use it to create a heat source or an energy source. You tie it to an air compressor, and then you have air compression at your plant. These technologies are something that's being adapted quite readily. And also you start thinking about, well, what happens if those go down? A lot of these have like Stirling engine type capabilities where you have a really high reliability factor. And these are some of the low hanging fruits, again, that if you haven't already looked at them, you should. And when it comes to data of how much methane are you venting, how much money can you make if you put that back in your sales line, and how much does it cost as capital and operational, those types of pieces of the puzzle are really easy to answer. We also have gas recovery systems. It's something where you start looking at the venting, especially venting, start looking at the flaring, and can you take that fluid and capture it back into a facility somewhere around the location? The main challenge that you're going to find is that that gas might have a terrible composition, really high in CO2, might have H2S in it, something along those lines. or it might be really low pressure. So the opportunities come where you start having maybe some parallel facilities where you can take the venting from one, move it into the other for processing, and also where there's large letdowns of pressure that are not being utilized. There's a lot of pressure regulators. You can use that to help boost up some of the pressure and do gas recovery schemes that are quite economical. When in doubt, you can also run some small compressors and just use those to boost that otherwise flared or vented gas back into a part of the facility that it can get reused. There are always situations where there's no easy answers, but that's where the innovation of the oil and gas field comes in. And of course, that's something that's ongoing. And sometimes when we start talking about compressors, we should also look at other things like multi-phase pumps or even adductors or ejectors. These are much lower maintenance solutions. And again, we're looking at the overall story, not just how much the capital costs, but how much is it going to cost to operate, how much power requirement, and is it going to be a headache to the operators at the plant? You always want to try and make things easier for the operators where you start getting resistance there as well. The last section that I want to talk about here is going into gas to X or abatement of the GHG emissions. We started a little bit later into the lunch. I noticed that we have only about 10 minutes left. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to leave it at this slide. And what I'm going to talk about just to this slide right here is it's the same idea. When you have a flare or you have a vent or you have some sort of fluid associated gas, let's say, that you want to convert to power, it's going to be the same workflow. You're going to look at doing the planning side of things, what technologies are out there for the conversion. As well, you're going to look at the local economics. Does this area of the world, can you sell methanol there? Can you sell power? Will the grid even accept power if you bring it? Are there other facilities there that could use some steam that's being raised? Those types of things you want to look in the planning. Again, you want to measure to make sure what is the concentration, what are the volumes that you're going to deal with. And once you know those, then you're going to act on it. You're going to put together the designing, the operation, the maintenance planning to actually put that in place. And then again, with the monitoring side, you want to validate it. You want to say, are we doing what we think we're doing? And then of course that goes to the recording and the certification. So my apologies that the last couple of slides I wanted to talk about more specifically on gas to X, which is more the area that I'm focused on. I'm going to skip for today, but I hope that this was a good introduction and getting into the right mindset for the Datathon that is ahead in February to come.
Thanks so much, Glenn. That was fantastic. A great introduction to where we're likely to see methane emissions coming from. So when we're looking at the satellite images that we get a hold of for the Datathon, we may be able to recognize those sources better. And also for the qualitative side of the competition, you see some solutions here as to how we can abate the emissions. So I think that's been some useful content. Now I'm not seeing many questions, or there's perhaps one here. Maybe it's just a comment from Sharon. Excellent job getting into the details of detection and controlling of methane.
Oh, great, thank you. I love the immediate feedback, it's appreciated.
Yeah, any comments, it doesn't have to be questions, drop some comments and be appreciated. But otherwise, I don't see any questions online, but we can have a couple of minutes while we wait for those. Questions from the audience in real life here.
Thanks, Glenn. Very good presentation. Just I want to have a comment here that I saw that gas compressions. You said about kind of controlling the emission. That was a couple of years ago, 6-7 years ago. That's done by one of the major oil and gas companies here. When they have gas compression station, they have all the seas methane from seas. They capture them and bring it back to air intake. So that's another way. You don't need to have a specific air production. So you just bring it back. And as far as the air is less than 80 L, you can inject it to the system.
Yeah, so it was more of a comment, but I'm just going to repeat it here just so the audience on virtually can hear it. It was a comment about the fact that there was just recognition that quite a few years ago, there were some gas recovery systems that were set up for compressor seals. And for the compressor seals, you have the low pressure reservoir of methane and other hydrocarbons coming out from the seal reservoir. And the comment is that that's a really easy way to re-inject that low pressure back into the suction intake of the compressor. And that is a perfect example of something that kind of you look around the environment and you see where the opportunities are there. Sometimes if you can't find the right configuration, there's not the right sequence for that type of a situation, I've also seen companies that set up small scale incinerators, and they take the low pressure seal gas off the reservoir and they bring it into incinerator. And sometimes those incinerators actually have multiple manifold feeds, and they can deal with dual pressure feeds coming in. So those types of solutions, again, if one solution doesn't work, you go to the next solution. But that's an excellent example of looking at a very close and very viable, practical way of doing things.
More interest, I can introduce you that you can prepare regarding technology.
Yeah, and from the simulation point of view, another thing to mention is that simulation point, taking that extra suction load, doing that recovery and stuff, those are the situations where simulators can be used as a very good first pass of how much you're going to pay for the extra power, how much is that scope 2 going to bring to emissions if you're being powered by coal or electricity, depending again where in the world you are, and then how much revenue you can recognize, as well as reduced potential penalties on emissions. So all of that being put together really comes into the digital world that also benefits.
So that the way you explain that is they're already practical, and also for hybrid pneumatic control, they already companies they're using nitrogen institute.
Yeah, air, nitrogen there. Yeah, that's a good point as well.
Is it worth repeating that point?
Yeah, there's also the point on the fact that some companies are using nitrogen, maybe not compressed air, but nitrogen or something for the pneumatics as well, venting out the...
Rent it, you can pay back.
Yeah, and all rentable solutions, module solutions as well.
So, Glenn, we have time for one question, I think, from Ahad online. It's a question about flaring. Can you comment on the routine versus non-routine emissions from flaring? Like, what's the percentage of each?
That's a good question. I do not have that number in my head, but I can comment on that. Is that as we are stepping forward year after year, it is definitely a moving target. I would say that whatever that percentage was at the beginning of the journey a couple of years ago, 5-10 years ago, is not the number today. Some of the organizations that I've been talking with around the world, they've already gotten to the point where most of their routine venting and flaring has already been eliminated. Sometimes not so much on the brown fields, but any green fields that are coming out, there's basically no routine venting and flaring already left. Some areas, some of them, especially in Europe that I've seen, are really, really advanced on this. I am in the IOGP task forces with regards to the abatement of such. So without giving a number, and my apologies that I'm not, I would say that the non-routine is coming up very quickly because of the fact that a lot of the routine stuff already has standard practice solutions. Non-routine flaring, of course, has the huge challenge of quick shutdowns, quick startups for the technical solutions, as well as the fact that if you think of getting a payback period for routine flaring that's happening over 365 days or maybe 350 days of uptime, anything that's non-routine, the techno-economics are that much more challenging because you only have a fraction of the payback. So I think as time goes on, better incentives, harsher penalties, and of course, better innovation and technologies will allow more non-routine flaring to be abated. But at this point in time, the only real good comment I can make is that the non-routine is continuously rising, some regions more than others very quickly.